Thomas Hobbes and ethical egoism. So first, a little background for our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes. Was English, born in 1588, died in 1679, and is of course still dead today. He was educated at Oxford in the school of scholasticism, which was a philosophical school which arose with Charlemagne and was dominant of European philosophy for quite some time. Many of the thinkers during the time period when Thomas Hobbes is Hobbesing, and known as the modern era of philosophy, roughly, there's a lot of debate about exactly when the modern era was, but roughly between 1500 and 1900 for philosophy. But this is extensively debated. And thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, John Locke, etc., were rebelling against scholasticism, and then later thinkers rebelled against them. One of his early jobs, or later jobs, was working as a tutor for the wealthy Cavendish family, which turns out to be very useful for him later on. He knew Francis Bacon, Galileo, and René Descartes. He wrote a series of objections to our good dead friend Descartes' meditations, and they were published by Descartes along with his replies to them. His main influence was in terms of his philosophical ethics and political philosophy was the English Civil War, which began in 1642, and grossly oversimplified, this can be seen as a dispute over the divine right of kings, whether there's going to be a strong monarchy, a Catholic monarchy, or a weaker monarchy and parliament. So the monarchy and the parliament were fighting. Hobbes ends up publishing his work, The Leviathan, his philosophical, masterpiece, in 1651. Because of his view presented of God in here, this apparently led some to refer to him as the father of atheists. Not in the sense that his kids were atheists, but in the sense that this would seem to, his view, philosophical view, would lead to atheism. So what was Hobbes, up to? Well, in the time Hobbes was Hobbesing, during this modern time period, this was what he's doing is what other philosophers like Descartes and Locke were also setting out to do, which is that they saw the current state of philosophy and science, etc., to be a bit of a mess, and they wanted to revamp, revolutionize the study of the physical world, human nature, society, philosophy, etc. And they would typically, Descartes and Hobbes especially, and other thinkers like Spinoza and Leibniz, would adopt a scientific method. And many of them turned to mathematics because of its certainty. And so he embraced, a scientific method because he wanted to make, political science more of a science. So his approach was what would be familiar to people who do the sciencey stuff today, which is essentially taking complex phenomena in the physical world, but also, as we'll see, one of his achievements was trying to apply this to people, to create a science of politics. And so the idea is you take complex phenomena, reduce them down to the simplest laws and most basic components to find out how things work. And his scientific motivation here is based on Galileo. Galileo is known for taking, matter to be the fundamental basis of reality, specifically matter in motion, moving matter, essentially matter. Now, in terms of where he fits, in terms of the classic political debate between empiricists, who claim that all knowledge comes through the senses, he's an empiricist. The opposing view is rationalism, held by thinkers like our good dead friend Descartes, who claim that you can know at least some things by pure reason, some things about the world. Empiricists did generally believe that you could know things like mathematics and that triangles have three sides by pure reason, but they believed that didn't tell anything about the world. So, for example, knowing that bachelors are unmarried is a priori. If someone is a bachelor, they're unmarried. But knowing whether a particular person is a bachelor or not, that's a matter of empiricism. You can't presumably know that through pure reason. And so empiricists believe what you know about the world comes through the senses. You can know other stuff like definitions in math through reason. And the rationalists think you can know some things about the world through pure reason. For example, most famously, the existence of God for thinkers like our good dead friend Saint Anselm and our good dead friend Descartes. So in the empiricist-rationalist dispute, empiricist, all knowledge from the senses. Now another classic dispute in philosophy is the nature of the world. And kind of the two big camps are materialism, which is the world is purely matter, purely physical, no incorporeal minds, no ghosty stuff, etc. It's all purely physical things, just bodies. The opposing view is dualism, held by thinkers like Descartes and Plato, where in the case of people like us, we have minds that are, for Descartes, incorporeal. They're non-physical, stuff, substances. And the mind that is the person has a body. And bodies, for people like Descartes who are dualists, the body itself doesn't do the thinking, etc. It's a purely physical entity. So in the case of human bodies. So for the dualist, their minds and bodies, metaphysically distinct. For the materialist, there's no distinct substances, mental substances, no ghosty stuff, etc. It's all purely matter. Now, materialists don't say there's no thinking or thoughts or minds, but all these thinkings and thoughts and minds are purely physical. And so you can explain for the materialist, everything is material. And the ultimate science to rule them all on this view, oversimplifying things, would be physics, the science of physical stuff. Now, what about God? As I noted earlier, he was called the father of atheists, not because presumably his kids were atheists, but because his views seemed to push towards atheism. So he does seem to believe or agree that nature does suggest that there's an ultimate cause, perhaps God. Now, he's a materialist, or was since he's dead. The idea of non-physical substance, incorporeal substance to him would be, there is none of that stuff. And so if there's a spirit of any type, like God, for example, angels, etc., these would have to be a very fine and transparent physical substance, almost kind of like a gas. So we might be able to say that God does exist on his view. His empirical approach would seem to entail that we can't know what God is. We can't access him through the senses. Now, there are empiricists who think, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, who think you can prove God's existence through the senses in his famous 5 ways. So Hobbes doesn't seem to come down as definitively atheistic in the sense that he doesn't, come out and just say, no God, because he's willing to admit there's an ultimate cause. But his God would be a physical God in a physical world, and hence obviously not very, very pleasing to most believers. So his approach essentially is that God is really not a subject for philosophy or science, and it should be left to people who study theology, essentially. So kind of, passing on it. So for him, the world is made up of physical stuff. Now, this is what's called an ontology. It's from the Greek ontos, meaning thing, which I mistranslated as stuff. And ontology is the study of what is. Not in the sense of studying like kiwis, both the fruit and the bird, or determining like how many varieties of beetles there are. There are a lot. It's in terms of what kind of metaphysical types there are. So part of one's ontology, if one believed in like souls, that would be part of the ontology. If you believe space and time are real, that'd be part of your ontology, part of what you think is real. So for Hobbes, he's a materialist. So there are natural bodies, which would be like rocks, water, etc., living bodies. But he also wants to look at politics. So one of his innovations was the idea of the body, politics, the political bodies, which are not natural bodies like rocks and water and beetles, but artificial bodies created by us. And he thinks the point of philosophy is to find the causal laws for both these natural bodies, rocks, water, planets, etc., living things, and artificial bodies. He's trying to create a science of politics. So what about his ethics? Well, to set the stage for the discussion to follow, which is a look at, briefly, at some of his work in the Leviathan. Again, it's an entire book, so we're not going to cover it in a short video or the course in its entirety. So he looks at ethics and morality in a way similar to the thinkers who are known as Epicureans. Their view is essentially, roughly put, they're about pleasure, hedonism. So his approach is to look at the question of what is morality in terms of human psychology. So what he thinks he finds, looking at it scientifically, that good doesn't refer to like a metaphysical entity. It merely refers to objects of desire. We call things good because we desire them, because we find them pleasant or think they're pleasant. In the case of evil, again, for Hobbes, that does not refer to like a metaphysical entity. It refers to things we wish to avoid, things that we find painful. And so good and evil for him, at least the way we call things good and evil, rest on pleasure and pain. And of course, people vary in what they regard as pleasurable and painful. And you can think of things as simple as like what movies people like. There's movies that obviously that some people like and some people really, really hate. Similarly for food, for music, etc. So many things. And so he reasons that good and evil are therefore subjective, because good and evil are essentially just pleasure and pain, and people vary in what they regard as pleasurable and painful, so good and evil is subjective. Now, in terms of human psychology, he thinks that humans are egoistic hedonists. That's to say, we're hedonists because we seek pleasure, and we're egoistic because we seek our own pleasure. So, in terms of psychological theories, Hobbes would probably be classified as a psychological hedonist, in that, as a matter of description, he claims that people will always seek to gain pleasure and avoid pain. And this is pretty standard, approach in the sciences and social sciences. Generally, the assumption is that's how people operate. Seek pleasure, avoid pain, etc. So, in this view, good is what yields pleasure, evil is what causes pain or death to the individual. And in a way, there's no sense in asking whether people ought to behave this way. As we'll see when we look at his theory, he doesn't so much talk about should people be that way. His view is that's the way people are. He thinks you have to work with what people are, as found by empirical investigation. So we now turn to looking in some detail at a bit of his theory from his work, The Leviathan. And this is from chapter 13 of The Leviathan. So he begins looking at people in terms of their nature. So he's going to try to essentially like science this situation. Now he claims that by nature we're equal. And as we'll see when we talk more about Hobbes later, it's not like a nice type of equality. But he thinks that humans are equal in body and mind. I mean, he's aware that obviously there are differences. Some people they're like, stronger, more endurance. Some people are smarter. Some people are more clever. Some have more charisma. But he thinks that the differences are so small that they amount to effectively nothing in the big picture. I guess in a way, spoilers. He thinks anybody can kill anybody, essentially. And in that regard, it's not that it's not like we have, superhuman, people who can't be harmed. So even though there are differences between us, the differences in the face of death amount to nothing. So he thinks that we have rough equality in ability, And so we all have a rough equality of hope in attaining our ends. And this, he thinks, leads right away to, conflict, because if two people want the same thing, whatever it is, money, fame, fortune, power, whatever, and they can't both have it, which is often the case, they become hostile to each other. They become enemies. And this is because each person is in the way of the other person. And this could be a matter of like their survival or simply enjoyment. And he thinks because of this, because if we want the same things and we can't share it, or we don't want to share it, this leads to conflict. And so we try to destroy or at least subdue one another. And so he presents his, sketching out his state of nature scenario. We'll say more of this in the future, but the idea essentially is he's imagining a scenario where there's no government, there's no, police, courts, militaries, etc., just people in the wild. There is, in his words, there's no power able to overawe all of us. So he thinks in that scenario that there's only grief in the company of others. It's always going to be bad. So why are people like this? Well, what he thinks kind of first off is this. Every person he believes, and this is, he's an empiricist, so you could check this yourself. He thinks each of us think other people should value us at the same value we look upon ourselves. We're a little clearer. The idea is essentially what he seems to be claiming is, I think everyone should value me as much as I value myself. And of course, it's unlikely that anyone's going to value me as much as I value myself. And so he thinks that people are basically triggered if people express contempt or fail to properly value a person. They will attempt to do something about that. So he thinks we're hostile in part because we think very highly of ourselves, and we think other people should think well of us too. But of course, people generally don't. So in terms of the three main causes of quarrel, of conflict that he thinks cause us to engage in the struggle are competition, diffidence, and glory. Competition is this. Essentially, people do harm to each other for gain. We use violence to become, in his words, become master of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. Basically, we use violence to take stuff and people from other people. In the case of defense, what he calls diffidence, we engage in violence to defend ourselves, to protect our possessions, or perhaps the possessions we just stole. Glory, it's a kind of an archaic term, but people still sometimes talk about like glory in the context of sports or war. The idea essentially is kind of like fame, but more so. And so we engage in violence for our reputation. That if we use this violence, if we're insulted, if someone expresses a different opinion or fails to properly value us. So basically we use violence to get stuff, to keep stuff, and when people fail to properly respect us. Now in this scenario, in this state of nature that Hobbes calls it, that there's no government. There's no power over people. There's no police. There's no courts. If you're familiar with video games, it's kind of like the battle royale model of games like Fortnite, where everyone just fights everybody. No teams. Now he thinks this state of nature is lacking and bad because in this state there's no industry, there's no culture of the earth, there's no navigation. Very specific list. No use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, basically import goods. There's no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing, such things as require much force. Basically, lack of buildings, lack of what we would call today construction equipment. Lacks of knowledge, accounts of times, arts, letter, and society. So all the good stuff of civilization, he thinks, in the state of nature, we're lacking. So what does the state of nature have for us? Well, what it's got is continual fear and danger of violent death. And in his famous quote, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, what about ethics and justice? Well, his view, they don't exist in the state of nature. Why? Because in this war of all against all, nothing is unjust. Because the notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, he believes, have no place in this state of nature. Because for him, there is no common power. There is no government. With no government, there is no law of this particular type. And where there is no law, there is no injustice. So his view is there in this scenario, without a government, there is no justice, there is no injustice. They just can't exist. They're, kind of crudely put, it's all a matter of political power and law is a matter of justice. Without the political power, there's no law, no justice, and no injustice. Now, this, of course, all sounds very awful, and Hobbes, agrees with this. So, what then motivates us to not be in this scenario? Now, Hobbes doesn't, argue that he's presenting an accurate historical account of how things, went down historically. It's essentially a more of a theoretical device. Like, imagine if there was no government, what would it be like, and how would we justify or why would we want to leave this? What would enable us to get out of this terrible scenario? What he claims is that our motivations are essentially selfish. First, we're afraid of death, and in the state of nature, death is always waiting for you. We also want things for good living. We want stuff, and we hope to attain stuff. What he calls commodious living. And that would be, obviously things like today would be things like house, food, TVs, Xboxes, PlayStations, etc. Now, one thing that philosophers in the time Hobbes is Hobbesing, and we still do today, is we often make sort of like vague references to reason, which is kind of the philosopher's version of intuitively. So when a philosopher says reason suggests, they're essentially kind of saying intuitively, hey, surely you agree with me. So he thinks that reason will provide us with articles of peace from which we can make an agreement. And he calls these articles of peace that we find through reason, he calls them the laws of nature. Now, he doesn't think these are presumably not created by like God or these odd metaphysical entities. And they seem to be, he thinks they're part of like the physical world. And given his view of how the world is purely physical and his view that he's doing a science of politics, these, for him, would be political laws comparable to like the laws of physics in a way. So what of these laws? Well, he claims that there are, there's the first and second natural laws, and he also is concerned about contracts. Roughly put, he thinks that's how we're going to get to what we would call ethics. Now, we have first off what he calls the right of nature, or in my bad Latin, jus naturale, horribly pronounced. This is a liberty that each of us has to use our power as we wish and as we will to preserve ourselves. So the first right of nature is that we have the freedom to do whatever it takes to preserve ourselves. And we can use whatever means we judge to be the best for this. So he defines liberty as an absence of external impediments, essentially that one is free of, obstacles, etc. Now he separates this from what he calls the law of nature, or in a terrible pronunciation, lex naturalis. For him, these are precepts or general rules, which are, again, being a philosopher, he says they're found by reason. And he thinks reason tells us, basically saying intuitively, that we should not do what is destructive of our own life or take away the means of preserving our own life. I mean, other people, you find to do that to them, but that is that, according to Hobbes, by reason, I would sort out that I'm forbidden to do what is harmful to myself and to, lose what would be means to preserve my life. And of course, this is all up to me, according to him. So that's the liberty to do what it takes to survive. And we're obligated by reason, he claims, this law of nature, to keep on like not dying. So it's kind of like a video game. You can do, battle royale. You have a freedom to grab whatever you can, do whatever it takes to survive. And the rule of the game essentially is try not to die. Now he distinguishes between rights and law, jus and lex. But he thinks, of course, those other people are wrong and they need to be distinguished. Right is a liberty to do or not do. You have, basically a freedom. Law, on the other hand, determines and binds. And so he believes that law and right, not in terms of like moral right, like good, but law and rights, differ as much as obligation and liberty. Because in the case of right, it's a liberty, law is an obligation. So then, what are these laws? Now, he claims that the most fundamental law of nature, so law 1, is this. Everyone has a right to everything. That's his assumption. Again, because, the objective is you're obligated to survive, and this gives you a right from this obligation, this law, to everything. So for him, the fundamental law of nature is a precept or general rule, again from reason, which is just intuitively, that every person ought to endeavor peace as far as you have hope of attaining it, and when you cannot, you should seek out and use all advantages of war. So basically, try to get peace, but prepare for war. Something echoed loud, after Hobbes. So this first branch contains the first and fundamental law of nature according to Hobbes. Seek peace and follow it. The second contains the sum of the right of nature, to defend yourself by all means by which you can. That's law number 1. Law number 2 is this. From this command to seek peace is derived the second law. He says, a man is willing, when others are also willing, to lay down the right to all things, as far as they think necessary for peace and self-defense, and be content with as much liberty against others as they would allow others against themselves. So what is he saying here? Well, he thinks the way you start heading towards like not war is each of us has to be willing to give up our right to all things to a certain degree. And we give it up as far as we believe it would achieve for us peace and self-defense. And we essentially allow others liberty against us that we would allow, we want to have liberty against them, and we allow them liberty against us. Roughly put, he's basically saying we give our right to all things, and we agree essentially to let other people have liberty too. Now, as long as we keep hold of the right of doing anything we want, we remain in this state of nature, which for Hobbes is the state of war, because there's no peace, there's just war. And if other people don't, lay down their right, you'd have no reason to give up your right to all things, because you would become, a victim if you basically unilaterally, said, I'm not going to, cause any harm to people. I'm not going to, mess with their stuff, etc. It'd be like, go imagine playing like a video game, battle royale video game where the goal is, everyone's fighting everybody. And one person just decides to not take the weapons and not harm people. Well, of course they would die super quick. The only way it works is if, as Hobbes notes, if people, cooperate, like if we just stop killing each other. So those are the first 2 laws. Then, of course, he throws in a third law. So what is a third law? The third law of nature for him is justice. So we're finally starting to get to some moral words in play. Justice, the third law of nature, is that we perform our covenants. And, of course, if we don't perform our covenants, then these are just empty words. Because if people don't stick to their agreements mean nothing. And without such agreements being stuck to, we can't get out of this state of war. Because if someone, imagine like a video game scenario where someone says, hey, I'll stop shooting you if you stop shooting me, and they lie, then, well, that's, of course, meaningless. And without someone to enforce it, people are saying what they're going to do, without people doing what they say they're going to do, agreements are meaningless. So he thinks that is the foundation and origin of justice, that this law of nature. Where there is no covenant, no agreement, there's been no transfer of right. And we remain in that scenario of, everyone has a right to everything. And in that scenario, Hobbes believed there's no injustice because everything is yours, everything is mine. And he believes there's nothing we can do that can be unjust because there's no agreements that we're breaking. Once we have a covenant, though, breaking it is unjust. So injustice is failing to perform one's covenant. And what is not unjust is just for him. So he has a pretty sharp dichotomy. It's not like a third category of things that are neither just or unjust. There's just unjust and just. So this all has to begin for him with government, with what he calls the Commonwealth. This is how we actually start getting from like a state of seemingly like no morality to morality, of at least of a certain type. So in part 2, now that we're starting to head towards some moral philosophy, we'll pick up looking at his moral philosophy, such as it is. So stay safe, avoid the state of war, and I'll see you in the future.